Hey friends, welcome back to the Lightcast. In this episode, I want to take some time to talk about the Zelda Canon and how to comprehend it. I'm going to include my approach in this, as well as approaches that I've kind of adopted from other people. But largely, I wanted to focus on showing people like perhaps how they could model the canon themselves, how to assess sources of information, and building a repeatable framework for analyzing canon. So if this is something that interests you, I think you're going to love this episode. I believe this is going to end up being the first part of this. Due to the density of this topic, I think this is going to be beneficial to splitting this into multiple episodes. This one focusing more on building like a canonical model, understanding some of the pitfalls that come with that as it relates to the broader community. And then I think in a future episode, I want to tackle divergences in source text and Nintendo of America localization for games and kinds of problems that come with that, and talking about like dealing with resolving conflicts and retcons and maybe my approach to that. Obviously, you don't have to use it, but I figure I couldn't hurt to share. This comes born out of a lot of requests for me to share my process more deeply and get into the hows of my theory construction. One thing I do want to note too is that in this episode, I'm going to be showing things on the screen throughout, and they're just mostly text aids, visual aids to help frame what I'm talking about. Of course, in the description, I'm going to be leaving a link to various resources as usual. So, all of that out of the way, I'm excited to share it with you. Let's take a look. So I think a good place to start would be to focus on modeling the canon for yourself. Now, I could tell you how to do this, and I could tell you the ones that I use. I think this would be a really good thing for if this is something that you're interested in, a topic that you're interested in, a hobby you want to get into. This is really something you should form for yourself. And while the community, the Brocker Zelda community, is very opinionated about this, Zelda Wiki is very opinionated about this, I think it's really important that from a personal enjoyment perspective to really figure out what that means to you first and foremost. And it goes without saying, why go through the effort of doing this? So if you want to get into this and you want to build like an evidence-based framework for understanding the canon, something that goes without saying is like you need a sort of set of rules to guide yourself. And those rules come out in a couple of different ways. The first one is what games count as canon in the series. A pretty straightforward rule that I use for myself is if something has been developed by Nintendo and published by Nintendo as a Zelda game, it's canon. If something has been published by Nintendo, developed by a third party, but has a key Zelda team member in a supervisory role, I treat that as canon. What is an example of that? Echoes of Wisdom is a great example. We have Grezzo, who is they are the third party, but is largely co-developed with the Zelda team and had several key members of the Zelda team, such as Aonuma, Fuchibayashi, folks like that, in supervisory roles helping them. This is also true of like Age of Imprisonment, for example. This, of course, I need to touch on something I think that is more interesting. So if you do this for yourself, and this is something you want to get into in terms of just like researching, this approach is very, very good, I think. I'm pretty biased, but it seems to work well for me. If you try to take your own view of the canon into a community or do theorization with it or share theories in public, be prepared that if your view of what the canon is does not align with what the broader community views as canon, which is not a homogenous thing, by the way, you could be met with friction. And a good example of this, under the rules that I just said that I use for myself, where if a third party's involved but a key Zelda team member is in a supervisory role, a game is canon. And the reason why I have these rules is because they give me something that is repeatable. And that's really, really important towards being able to understand and comprehend anything, any information system, really. Where you will run into some friction with this is for things like Age of Calamity, where it meets these rules, but you have groups in the community, the broader community, that believe that is not canon. And obviously, again, first and foremost, I'm going to say, do these things for yourself, like build this up for yourself in your own enjoyment first, because at the end of the day, what you enjoy the series is what matters the most, and it doesn't matter what any talking head, myself included, tries to tell you is right. I think why it matters, though, getting back to the point, is having a set of repeatable rules is a good way to relax the potential for you to have bias in your own theories if you are to make some Zelda theories. This process, of course, could be applied to anything, even in the real world, like scientific research, but it is a good way to help relax your own biases, right? So that you don't end up in the trap of being where we're at with Age of Calamity, where most people don't think it's canon because they don't like the writing. And frankly, I think as anything that's like an evidence-based repeatable framework, that's really not a good reason to say something doesn't count as information. I don't like a lot of entries in the Zelda series. I like some for their lore while hating their gameplay mechanics. I enjoy some of the gameplay mechanics while thinking the story is frankly garbage. That happens. So I think, like I said, it's really important for you to do this for yourself, but be advised, like if you're to take these things into a community, at least be able to explain your perspective and your system to somebody. They may still be very hostile towards you anyway. This is going to happen. It's the world of online. My friend Captain Bergerson calls this, I believe, something like, I'm losing it at the moment, but it's effectively like hazards of the job kind of thing. Now that we've covered games, I think a really good place to pivot to next are books. So throughout the life cycle of the Zelda series, games of course come with their own handbooks. And then in 2011, we have the first of the Goddess Collection books really come out, where with Hyrule Historia, and not to go like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but this while I regard it as a bad move, I'm just kidding. If you want to include things like that as sources, kind of like the games, and decide what's canon, here's some good practical advice I could give you. Treat them as supplementary sources rather than primary sources, meaning they can supplement any given game or games depending on what the piece of lore is, but it can't. Don't accept things in them that may contradict something you see in the game. The reason for this is due to a certain kind of pitfall with the way that those books are translated. Historia is probably the worst at this in terms of having things that contradict the direct canon. And I have a Lightcast episode on this that I will try to link just so you have it, because there's a lot of this information's cataloged. I'm getting ready to do a second pass at the encyclopedia in an episode. Anyhow, the thing that the reason why it's like something you want to maybe consider only as a supplementary source rather than anything that can really act as a superset of the canon is due to lore inconsistencies where things that are in the English don't align with what is in the games. A good example of this just off the top, and I'm not going to go on this too far because this topic has been kind of beat to death, but you may not be familiar with it if you haven't been in the community for very long. There's commentary about the hero shade in Historia that doesn't align with what's in the games. And that's really important to kind of like take into consideration. Of the books in the Goddess Collection, Encyclopedia is probably the one that is better at aligning with the existing canon. And its worst flaws are more that it omits things that are available, and they're not exactly like the most important things in the world. Like, it could be a set of, like butterflies, and maybe across all the games there are 10 butterflies, and it may only have 6, for example. So it's like it's like flaws of omission rather than being contradictory or canon breaking. So something to be considerate there. And then finally, in terms of building your own model of the canon, I really say is a good starting place, like beyond the other two, is to bring in developer interviews. In a lot of cases, developer interviews are really good supplementary secondary sources, kind of like the books, where occasionally you get little extra tidbits of lore, and they can confirm other research that are really, really helpful. This happened to me, where for a long time, myself and others thought that a lot of the magic and capabilities wielded by Rauru were directly tied to like a little bit of esoteric magical pagan beliefs in the West, and then additionally just various topics around like Onmyodo and Gauss magic and Taoist sorcery. And it was in an interview where this information was pretty much confirmed via talking about like the dragon meridians being points under Hyrule that are concentrations of energy, and how that ties back, and that's like Taoist sorcery 101 type stuff. So developer interviews can be really, really awesome in that way. They can help you confirm some things, or at least give you hints and maybe act like a compass to keep you going in a direction if you're trying to research something. I would say, too, tread lightly with them, and the reason why is because there are times when things get injected after the fact into canon that do cause some problems later on. I would say a pretty good example of this is the magically forced evolution of the Zora into the Rito in Wind Waker. While it's never outright said that the Zora evolved into the Rito, there are hints there, and a lot of players suspected something was going on with it. And this is due to like iconography, cultural stuff, all kinds of things. Like the clues were there, of course, but it wasn't really until a developer interview where Eiji Aonuma said that they adapted to be able to survive the world after the flood. And the reason why that's problematic is because in a game, the introduction of lore tends to be a little more comprehensive around the point, an individual point. Not perfect at giving all the details, but what they do share tends to be at least somewhat comprehensive most of the time. Let's just leave it at that. Where this gets really, really challenging, though, is without enough detail in being sourced from a developer interview, there's things that are unspoken, such as, okay, well, if the Sora turned into Rito, did the Rito exist before the Wind Waker? The answer to that, of course, is yes, because it did not make its way into the localized version of the Minish Cap, but there are Rito in the Minish Cap. The little bird that you play when you play your ocarina that takes you up to the skies is a Rito rock. That's a good example of a developer interview giving enough information that it becomes a little bit more like the canon version of a loaded gun, where depending on what you're pointing it at, it's either going to be really effective or cause a lot of problems. So that's something to be aware of, at least. And last but not least, before we move on to kind of like building a repeatable framework for analysis, is the in versus out of universe component of understanding the lore. In games, the majority of the time, characters and what they understand of history is just their understanding, and it may be wrong. So if the character says something, you kind of need to be able to back it up with multiple things, either in the same game from different characters, or I would say out of universe sources too. Developer interviews can provide that at times too. This is important because a lot of people have a flawed understanding of what's going on in the canon due to the fact that the writing style writes things in this way, and where this plays out. For example, if you talk to the Skull Woods Maiden in A Link to the Past, and you talk to Sahasrara, you will get different takes on some of the imprisoning war lore. And then, of course, the intro on the title screen gives you some more information, and that's really good. But that's also still written from an in-universe perspective and those characters' understanding of what those events were. And if you look at it, nobody really knows the complete history of what happened with the imprisoning war. Sahasrara himself even says that a hero is supposed to appear out of the line of knights, and then he kind of drops the topic as if to suggest no hero showed up. And thanks to a bunch of interviews and things over time, we know at least as far back as 2008, the supposed Hero's Defeat ending of Ocarina of Time that nobody has ever seen was at least circulating in internal circles within third-party companies that wanted to make Zelda games. I think this is around like the Retro Studios project that never became anything, and then it finally appeared in Historia and is a giant point of contention for a lot of people in the fandom. But if you look at the clues inside of A Link to the Past, it's very obvious that a hero didn't show up during that conflict. Even the Skull Woods Maiden says that she still believes a hero will appear one day. She signals that she feels like the prophecy of the calamity has come true, which is that if a hero should fall, the world will become engulfed in evil. And that's really interesting because you kind of have to be able to analyze it as what those characters know versus what the actual truth is. And sometimes they only know the legend and the myth, but they don't know the complete history. If you want a really good demonstration of this, go play A Link to the Past, and then go play A Link Between Worlds, and look for references in A Link Between Worlds back to A Link to the Past. what you're going to notice is that characters' understanding of the events of A Link to the Past don't quite exactly match what happened in A Link to the Past. So with that out of the way, the next part really is more focused on that repeatable framework. So while I covered the canon models extensively, obviously, again, just gonna reiterate this a billion times, I guess. That's something that I do. You don't have to go to that extent. I think like understanding what games count as being canon to yourself matters more than anything else. And obviously, if you're gonna try to take your views and your theories into like a debate with somebody, and you have a really, really unique view about what the canon is, that can be met with friction. So it's about trying to figure out how to like do it for your own enjoyment first. That goes without saying. Consider if you really want to or need to take that sentiment to other people. It's perfectly reasonable to enjoy the series in isolation without ever sharing your theories with anybody else. So that preamble out of the way, the repeatable framework I think matters the most. Once you understand what things come as sources, what things come as canon to yourself, one of the things that you can do is basically do a really straightforward 4-part kind of repeatable framework of how you process information. Source hierarchy being the first step, internal consistency with other games. I'm going to explain this more in a minute. Historical developer context. And that goes back to the idea of Miyamoto hasn't made a Zelda game in a long time. So if he starts coming out and saying what the canon is, am I going to take that as being more important than something that the current series producers and directors have to say about it? Unless they're there present with him and affirming what he says. Anyway. And then falsifiability. And we're going to get into all of these. Source hierarchy is fairly straightforward. We kind of touched on it a bit with the cam models, but generally speaking, it's pretty well accepted that the games kind of rule all in terms of being a source, like a source of information. They sit above pretty much everything else. Be what I discern that hierarchy is important. For me, in most cases, it's pretty much games, companion books, and so booklets that come with the individual games, Masterworks books, Guy's collection, and then developer interviews. And figuring out that hierarchy for yourself is really important. And historical developer context kind of comes into play there too, because like if you're going to include a developer interview, again, something that's said like one time and has no pattern of behavior, like you have to really take those things into consideration. And I tend to treat them more like anecdotes or as evidence, such as like if like 20 years ago after Four Swords Adventures released, if Miyamoto said something like the piranha plants actually exist but you don't see them in the game and there's an entire underworld filled with piranha plants, I'd be like, okay, I guess that could be true, perhaps, maybe. You don't see it, but like I'm gonna take that with a grain of salt until there's like a pattern. Now if we play a game in the future and there was like a go to the underworld and be like, holy shit, there's a lot of piranha plants, I'd be like, huh, okay, so that's really fascinating. So that's what I mean by, if you're not treating things as in a hierarchy for sources is really important. So internal consistency is a bit easier. A lot of the mechanics as the Triforce, for example, kind of vary at times in the way that they're described. There are some truths to it. One of them being like it doesn't judge good or evil, and so an evil wielder may obtain it and make a wish, perhaps, right? And that comes from A Link to the Past, and it has been reiterated in a few games, lost in my mind at the moment as to what they are. But we have some consistency there. But then games even like before and after Ocarina of Time that make those claims, and then but in Ocarina of Time, of course, Ganondorf breaks into the Sacred Realm after Link pulls the sword and he touches the Triforce and it splits. So if the Triforce doesn't judge good or evil, then the next question you would ask yourself is, well, why did that happen? And this is explained. I'm intentionally not going down the rabbit hole on it, but try to understand what the consistency of usage is for something in the series is really important. That's a good example of internal consistency, when the mechanics stay the same over time. And then, historical developer context, I've touched on this a ton, but just to really reiterate once more, looking at the time that something was provided in an interview against what's actually being said and whether it's held true over time, I think is really important. Somebody saying something one time in an interview should not ever overrule like something that's been shown as a pattern that opposes that interview information in games. before and after, for example. And then there's falsifiability, which is if you have an observation about something you feel about, test it in some kind of capacity and prove that it's correct or incorrect. That's very hard with something like Legend of Zelda, but it is possible. Falsifiability in The Legend of Zelda is kind of challenging because you can really achieve like falsifiability through observation or experiment. Primarily, there is other ways, but in game mechanics and like how combat system works, that's experimenting. You can easily do those things and see how like a combat system works in a game. And we have communities that do that, like the lovely Zelda data collection and research community that literally just figures out how game mechanics work from data mining and playing the games and experimenting, which is cool. The observation side of it is a little more challenging, though. To really drive that home, I'm going to use a small example from the next part to really explain more about that. So if we take the learnings of the Zora Book 2, where Sidon is talking about Ruto as an ancestor, there's some things that we can learn from that. In that monument, one of the things that Sidon refers to is some event that's unfolded in history where Zora rivers their bodies are floating on the river and a tragic situation's unfolding at Zora's domain. If you were trying to figure out how the ordering and chronology of some events that you've heard about in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, such as when that event occurred, there's some things we could do with reasoning, and this is part of falsifiability. So in that monument, Sidon mentions the domain, so we know the Zora's domain exists. Zora's domain is established. We know from other lore that Zora's domain was built around or over 10,000 years ago. I'm not going to get into that, but after the Zora came to the kingdom in search of fresh water. So we know from that one piece of information, we can discern and prove that the domain must have been built first before the story of Rio happens in history. As for when that is, we're not going to get into that, but you get the idea. So that's a really base set of falsifiability through observation. Likewise, there's the flip side to that coin too. I give you an example that it's pretty provable. Here's an example that wouldn't be provable. Let's say that I have this belief in my head that Akkala Citadel was built before the Great Calamity. A game really provides the lore that it was built at the peak of Hyrule. And it's not really much help because it's like Hyrule's a mountain, its history is a mountain, and it's a lot of valleys and it has a lot of peaks. What we can do though is go and observe the environment. So say we go to Akkala Citadel and in Breath of the Wild, for example, and go and climb up the Sheikah Tower and look around. And then you have this aha realization that, wait a second, the Sheikah Tower is broken through the floor of a room that used to exist in Akkala Citadel. So what can we determine from that? The tower must have been buried prior to the construction of Akkala Citadel because it broke through a room there. That's a good example of like disproving an internal belief where I've proven false that Akkala Citadel probably couldn't have come before the Age of Calamity because there's a tower buried under it, and the towers were buried after the Sheikah were banished and scattered. So you kind of get the idea. This is just a good extreme example that is kind of like a zooming in on that one thing. Obviously, there's more things you would want to take into account there. Is there any evidence that maybe somebody refurbished the keep afterwards, a long time afterwards, and maybe that room didn't originally exist there, but then you can't. There's like a limit to it. If you don't have any information that's available for that, you kind of got to go with what you could prove in the moment and then update it if new information comes along. And with all of this kind of pretext together here, I wanted to plug this into a real complete example, demonstrating how you might apply this framework to something broader. In this case, we're going to take a look at the Langs of the Zora, part 2, as shared by Sidon, and it's about the ancestor Ruto. And there's some things that we know. We have outside knowledge, obviously, that he doesn't have. We have, in some cases, you may have played Ocarina of Time. If you haven't, you can go online and see what happened there. And this is really cool because this is like that gateway to really understanding individual nuances of the story and the lore. So in this monument, Sidon says, long ago, there was a strong-willed Zora princess who was as meandering as a winding river. This princess, who was dearly loved by her fellow Zora, was as noble as she was innocent. Her name was Ruto. One day, a powerful and wicked man tried to take over Hyrule and brought great ruin to the once peaceful Zora's domain. Our tales speak of fallen Zora soldiers drifting down the river as it sadly reflected the chaotic retreat of the terrified Zora. Princess Rio bravely fought back her tears as she bore witness to the tragic misery unfolding in the domain. Even amid her heartbreak, the Zora princess did all she could to help the weak and elderly escape. Next, she swam against the river's current and climbed the mighty waterfall to challenge her foe. The details of this fight have fallen victim to the haze of time. Few details remain. Still, it is said that she was aided by the Princess of Hyrule and the hero of legend, and together they saved Hyrule. So the legend goes. I, Sidon, Princess of Zora, cannot help but ponder these events as I listen to the Zora children play in all their innocence. As Princess Ruto's descendant, it is my fate to carry the torch of her brave acts into tomorrow and beyond. I shall not fail. So we have several clues here that are really interesting in terms of understanding this piece of the canon. Analysis on this level can actually generate theories you didn't even know you're looking for too, and I'm going to show you why. So in the story, there's some things that we can deduce, right? The domain exists at this point. Ruto swims up the waterfall, and to face this foe, unleashing havoc on the domain, she is aided by the princess and the hero, and ultimately they push back the foe, right? So from that, aside from the chronology of understand that the domain obviously existed prior to this, and we have surrounding lore that says that the domain was built and it was actually carved out of a single blue stone, according to records. Sometime after the Zora sometime after the Zora came to the kingdom in search of fresh water. And then the details around the princess and the hero in confronting the foe are put together, and this can make you ask some questions. So, 1, does this actually happen in things that we know about in Ocarina of Time? And the answer is not quite. I'm intentionally not going into the Japanese source text for this because it's actually more detailed in this way. I want to keep this simple for this example because it includes a lot of other details that kind of really affirm this point, such as Ruto and her elite soldiers actually were crucial in securing the victory in Hyrule against this man. Regardless, none of those things actually happen in Ocarina of Time. By the point that we are an adult, Ruto is already in the water temple guarding it, and we see Ruto in the water temple, and then we see Ruto in the Chamber of Sages after she is awakened. As a child, obviously, there's the whole thing of rescuing her from Jabu Jabu. There is no interaction where Link, Zelda, and Ruto fight this man at Zora's domain together. This is one of those moments where it's like, okay, so hold on a second. A lot of the details, Sidon says, are hazy and lost to the haze of time. But some details are clear, and of the details that are clear, they're crystal. It's not written in a mythic tone. So this can make you examine and ask some questions, right? If he is describing very, very clearly events that we know didn't happen in Ocarina of Time, what is he actually referring to? I'm not going to speculate what I think it means, because I think it's important for other people to take that speculation and think about it. I am going to cover it eventually, but this is a good example. So in applying this framework, we can actually see how the repeatable steps come into play here. We have taken time to layer some sources, right? So we have a primary source that's coming from the game, comes from Tears of the Kingdom, and then we're mentioning that we know that the Zora came to the land of Hyrule in search of fresh water long ago, before they built Zora's domain, and that comes from Breath of the Wild, Masterworks, and or creating a champion. The source text and the English text said mostly the same thing. And then, in this case, historical developer context doesn't really apply because there's not an interview associated with this. And then, ultimately, falsifiability, which is, okay, so to some degree I covered this earlier, but we're able to say, okay, so the domain must have existed, the Zora must have come to this land in search of fresh water, found it, and carved Zora's domain out of the single blue rock, as mentioned in Breath of the Wild Masterworks / creating a champion, and the story of Ruto must come after. And then there's other stuff too. We can also take other details, such as Ruto, her elite guard, the hero, the princess, facing off against this very bad foe at Zora's domain after swimming up the waterfall, which, you might presume is a Zora fountain. And we can say, okay, so an event like that didn't actually happen in Ocarina of Time that we saw while playing it. So from a falsifiability perspective, we know that this might be referring to something that we haven't seen before, or maybe it's blended history of something else. Either way, we know that there may be a little bit of a hole in that record, and what that actually means more broadly, it's a whole other follow acts, but I think for the sake of this example, that's as far as I'm going to take it. And that's just applying that same process. And you can see the introduction of new questions can actually build up ideas for theories. Like, okay, so maybe this is referring to, I don't know, hypothetically speaking, a parallel set of events that is like a parallel ocarina of time that we never saw. This is just me saying a contrived example. You get the idea. Anyhow, yeah, I wanted to really just go through this. I know that there are a lot of people who have been more interested in getting deeper into Venom and perhaps wondering what process they could maybe take to start to understand the canon and be able to digest data and factual information. There's obviously a lot of stuff that I have not even included in this, and it's just due to the density of the topic against preferences. For example, I didn't lean too much into translated source text. That's a preference that I have. I prefer to prioritize source text over localized text, and that is really just due to a lot of things that, quite frankly, historical decisions around localization from Nintendo America if you are playing this as an English speaker in the West, and the consequences of that stemming back from like the 80s, where a lot of references to things in games were changed more or less due to the kind of like ending of the satanic panic of the late 80s and whatnot. And then now that the canon has been diverging like for a long time due to that, even through the 90s, a lot of things that are still kept are actually kept because they are being consistent with canon that was diverged a long time ago. And it's like a giant, it's like a windshield crack where it starts really small and then over time it becomes this huge problem. I think that there's some things like that to take into consideration too. But I think if you're just trying to get started in understanding the canon at all, like having a place to begin, I hope that this is helpful. That said, I'm always glad to have you on. Thanks for joining me, and I will catch you next time.